We will discuss today a number of issues which are all related to one core issue. The core issue is, what is the status of the 3 fast days? When I say 3 fast days, I mean Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, Asara B'Tevet, and Tzom Gedalia, and is to say, with the exclusion of Tisha B'Av. What is the status of those 3 fast days today? When I say status, I mean to say, are these days when we are obligated to fast, when we are allowed to fast, or when we are obligated not to fast and rather to rejoice? Because in theory, halachically, all those 3 possibilities exist according to the sugya that we're about to see. And related to this is the question of what was done during the time of Beit Sheni. Did the Jewish people fast on Tisha B'Av during Beit Sheni? This is related to this topic, as we shall see. Without further preamble, let us begin. The first thing to know, which most people actually do not know, is that the status of the fast days, in fact all 4 fast days, including Tisha B'Av, is not something absolutely fixed for all time. It's not immutable. It is designed to change according to the reality. This is not a new idea. This is a very ancient idea. This idea appears for the first time in the Tanakh, no less. It appears in Sefer Zechariah. If you have a look, source number 1, which is quoting from Sefer Zechariah, Perek Zayin, chapter 7, and moving through a number of psukim, skipping out most of the psukim in between, going on to chapter 8. What we find there is as follows. It says, "Vayihi b'shnat arba leYoash hamelech haya davar Adonai leZechariah b'arba lachodesh hatishei b'Chisleu." The pasuk tells us that Hashem spoke to Zechariah. Why did he speak to Zechariah? Because of what it now relates in the second pasuk. Vayishlach Beth El Sar Eser v'Rechem Melech v'Anasho lehalot et Panei Adonai. Because there were Jews in Chutz La'aretz, in Bavel, who had been exiled from Eretz Yisrael many years before. We're talking here approximately 70 years after the destruction of the first Mikdash. And as these events are taking place, the second Mikdash is being built. They're in the middle of building the Mikdash. It's not yet complete, but they've begun building it. The question that was asked was as follows: Lemor, in Pasuk Gimel, Ela Kohanim asher levet Adonai Sevaoth ve'ela Nevi'im lemor. Go and ask the Kohanim and the Nevi'im the following question: Ha'evkeh b'chodesh ha'hamishi, should I mourn in the 5th month, that is the month of Av, Hindazer ka'asher asiti zeh kamesh shanim, and engage in different forms of abstaining from different things, meat, wine, entertainment, etc., as I have done for many years. This is the question. Now, why was this question being asked? The question was being asked because these Jews understood, before it was even said to them explicitly, they understood that there was a question here to be asked. There was a real issue. The issue is, we began fasting, not because, by the way, Hashem told Am Yisrael to fast. That's not true. And even the Nevi'im did not tell the Jewish people to fast as a result of the first Mikdash, but the Jewish people felt that it was necessary and correct and proper to fast as a result of the Churban, of the destruction of Yerushalayim, the Mikdash, and Eretz Yisrael. The fact that Eretz Yisrael was now empty of Jews, this was a huge national catastrophe, and it was proper to fast and to beseech Hashem to turn the situation around. And that's the important thing to remember. When we fast, we're not just fasting because of that which was. We're fasting about that which is at the present time as well, and what we would like to see in the future. It's not just a question of national remembrance, of a memory, a vague national memory. So these Jews understood that perhaps we should no longer have to fast. Because now Jews have returned, some Jews have returned to Eretz Yisrael, not all the Jews, we know, but some Jews returned, and the Mikdash was being rebuilt. Yerushalayim was being rebuilt. So perhaps now there's no reason to fast. That was the question. So already here we hear and we learn the initial principle and rule of thumb that these fast days, all four, at this point they're asking about all four fast days, certainly about Tisha B'Av, the month of Av. Should we fast? Because now we see the reality has changed, and we were fasting because we were both mourning for what was, and we were asking and beseeching Hashem to change the situation for the better. And now the situation is changing for the better. The answer given later in Perek Heth by the Navi in the name of Hashem appears in front of you. That's Pasuk Yod Heth. Wahi devar Adonai Sevaoth Elai lemor. Ko amar Adonai Sevaoth. Thus says Hashem. Som HaRevi'i, that's Yud Zayin B'Tammuz, the fourth month, Tammuz. Usom HaHamishi, and the fast of the fifth month, which is Tisha B'Av, which is the fifth month of the year. Usom HaShevi'i, that's Som Gedalia, Tishrei. Usom HaAsiri, that's Asara B'Tevet, the 10th month. Yelevet Yudah L'Sason, U'Simcha, U'Mu'adhim Tovim, U'Ha'emet, U'Ha'Shalom, Ehavu. The answer is not, to be honest, very clear. That's the problem. The answer is not very clear. It doesn't say, yes, you have to continue fasting, or no, you don't have to continue fasting. It says, these fast days will be, it's not clear, does it mean right now, does it mean in the future? Not entirely clear. These fast days will be days of rejoicing for the Jewish people. In other words, there will not always be fast days. Their status and their essence will change into days of rejoicing when the situation of Am Yisrael's general national circumstance and condition is changed completely for the better. That is the basis of the whole discussion. And this pasuk is then discussed in Masechet Rosh Hashanah. What we find in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, that's source number 2 before you, is the Mishnah. The Mishnah states, Al Shisha Hodashim Hashluchim Yoseim. 6 months of the year, the Beit Din in Yerushalayim, when they received testimony that the new moon had been seen, they accepted that testimony and they declared that today is the new moon, that is to say, today is the first day of the new month. They would send out messengers to inform the Jews, both in other parts of the country, outside Yerushalayim, and even outside the borders of Eretz Yisrael, to tell them when the new month had been declared, so that people would know when certain important dates were about to come and roll along. Such as, it says in the Mishnah, Al Nisan Mipnei Pesach. People have to know when Rosh Chodesh Nisan was, so they know that the 14th is Erev Pesach. If we're talking about a time when there is a Korban Pesach, people have to know when to arrive in Yerushalayim to do the Korban Pesach. If we're talking about a time when there's no Korban Pesach, people still have to know when the Leila Seder, when are the 7 days that you can't eat Chametz, etc. So for the month of Nisan, people had to be informed. Al Av Mipnei Ta'anith. For the month Rosh Chodesh Av was also announced, and messengers were sent out to inform the Jewish people, because people have to know what day of the year, what day of the month is Tisha B'Av, which day they have to fast. And the same is true for Elul, so that people will know when Rosh Hashanah falls 30 days later. Al Tishrei mipnei takanat hamu'adot. The same is true for the month of Tishrei, so people will know when Yom Kippur and when Sukkot will be. Al Kislev mipnei Hanukkah. People also have to know when to celebrate Hanukkah, so they have to know when Rosh Chodesh Kislev is. Wal Adar mipnei Purim, and also Purim, the month of Adar, people have to know when to celebrate Purim. The other months of the year, it's not necessary to send shlichim, because it doesn't make a difference. Either today's Rosh Chodesh or tomorrow's Rosh Chodesh. If they were living in a part of the world such as Bavel, when they were not sure if today or tomorrow was Rosh Chodesh, because it can only be one of 2 days, because a lunar month is 29 and a half days, and therefore each lunar month in our calendar is either 29 or 30 days. So the first day of the next month is either the 30th day or the 31st day. And if you're not sure, you keep 2 days Rosh Chodesh. That's the basis for the idea of keeping Rosh Chodesh for 2 days. So if you live in such a place where the word didn't get to you, so you kept Rosh Chodesh for 2 days, no big deal. but it did not affect what you did, anything else during the month that you needed to know. So only 6 months of the year did they send out these shlichim. When the Mikdash stands, they also would send out shlichim for the month of Iyar, which is the month after Pesach, for those who missed Korban Pesach, for Pesach Sheni. Those who are not able to do Pesach Rishon need to know when Pesach Sheni will be. That's the Mishnah. Now if you look at the Mishnah, and you understood what we just read, you should immediately ask me a question. We just said that for the month of Av, Rosh Chodesh Av, shlichim are sent out to tell people what? When Rosh Chodesh Av was fixed. Why? Because they need to know when to fast Tisha B'Av. What about the month of Tammuz? We don't need to know when to fast on the 17th of Tammuz or the 10th of Tevet. So why don't we see these days, these months mentioned here? That is the question that the Talmud asks. It says immediately below in your source sheet here, number 2, the Gemara says, surely they should also be sending out messengers for those months such as Tammuz and Tevet. And then the question is further amplified and explained. Because it says in the Gemara as follows, based on the pasuk that we just saw from Sefer Zechariah, that these different fast days will one day also become days of celebration. But as long as the situation has not changed, they will not become days of celebration. They remain fast days, and therefore we have to know when to fast, and therefore we need to have messengers for those months. So why does the Mishnah not speak about these months? And the Gemara says, "Karelo hosom u'karelo hosason u'simcha." These days, we see in the pasuk, are referred to as Som HaRevi'i, Som HaHamishi, the fast day of the 4th month, the fast day of the 5th month, and they're also referred to as days that will become days of celebration. So these days are not unidimensional. These days have at least 2 dimensions to them. In fact, we'll see in a moment they perhaps even have more than 2 dimensions. But they certainly have 2 dimensions. It is either on, so to speak, or off. Either it's a fast day or it's a day of celebration. If it's not a day of celebration, and the Mishnah and the Gemara is assuming that it's not so, then it must be a fast day. If it's a fast day, then we need to know. If we need to know, then there should be a messenger being sent. The answer the Gemara gives, Amar Rav Papa, Hacheka Amar, this is what is meant. Rav Papa explains to us now something very, very important and something new, which the Sugya did not know, as it were, till this moment. And that is that there's not just 2 dimensions, there's actually 3 dimensions. There are 3 possibilities with regards to each of these days, each of these 4 fast days. The first possibility is Bizman sheyesh shalom yulas asonu l'simcha. If we're talking about a period of what's referred to as shalom, and according to most mefarshim, this certainly means, amongst other things, that there is a mikdash. It probably also means other things, as we'll discuss presently, but certainly there has to be a mikdash in order for the situation to be considered one of shalom, that is to say, a period of peace and tranquility and good and blessing for the Jewish people. There has to be a mikdash. Without a mikdash, it's not something we can refer to as shalom. If it is that kind of situation, then those are days of celebration. That is to say, and Rashi explains here, that these are days when we are not allowed to fast. We have to now celebrate and rejoice and thank Hashem that the situation has been turned around. As we said, we don't just fast because of what was, we fast also because of what is or what is not now and what we want there to be in the future. So when the situation is turned around, we also turn around our behavior, our reaction, and we thank Hashem. We're not allowed to fast on those days. That's in the ideal situation. The second possibility, says Rav Papa, is Yesh Shema. That's the opposite. When the situation is terrible, when the Jewish people are being persecuted and suffering greatly at the hands of their persecutors, their enemies, or the people who have invaded and occupied their land, such as the Romans at that time. In that situation, there's no question, all these 4 days are days of fasting and mourning. Why? Again, because we want Hashem to help us and change the situation for the better. But there's also a third possibility. There's a possibility which is neither tzom, neither disaster, neither shmad, which literally means persecution, nor is it shalom, neither is it an ideal situation. And that's called en shemad, en shalom. It's neither one nor the other, an intermediate situation. In that reality, says the Talmud, rasu mith'anim, rasu en mith'anim, which means then it's reshuth. One is allowed to fast on those days, but it's not an obligation. Every individual, this is how it's understood, as we'll see presently by the Geonim and also by Rashi and the Rambam. Every individual decides for himself whether he's going to fast or not fast in that intermediate situation.
It's optional.
It's optional.
Wait, are our times included in that?
Well, that's why we're here. That's exactly what we're discussing.
We don't have a Beit HaMikdash, but
We don't have a Bet Mikdash, but we also don't have... exactly, you're quite right. So that's exactly the point. And then Gemara goes on to explain that in practice, we exclude Tisha B'Av from this discussion. And this discussion really is focusing only on the 3 fast days of Tzom Gedalia, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, and Asar B'Tevet. Because Tzom Tisha B'Av is considered more serious, more severe, because many great calamities occurred on that day. The first Mikdash, the second Mikdash, the Gzerah of not entering Eretz Yisrael at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, after the Meraglim, and many other events took place at that time. So Tzom Tisha B'Av has a special, more severe status. So everything we're about to say from this moment on, based on what the Gemara says explicitly, that Tisha B'Av has a different status, everything we're about to say refers to the 3 fast days and not all 4 of them. In other words, all of them except Tisha B'Av. Now, with regards to the question of how should we relate to our present situation? Are we today in a situation of shalom? Are we in a situation of shemad, which is the opposite, persecution, and Am Yisrael is weak, powerless, and at the mercy of its enemies? Or are we in some kind of intermediate situation? If you turn over to the second page, the top of the second page, Rabbeinu Hananel, who lived 1,000 years ago in North Africa, in his Perush on the Gemara, he says as follows: Yesh shalom, what does that mean? Klomar, kol zman shebet hamikdash kayam yelas asonu lesimcha. As long as the mikdash stands, these are days of rejoicing, not days of fasting at all. Yesh shemad, if on the other hand it's a period of shemad, which is persecution, then they're all obligatory fast days. En shemad, wa en shalom, if it's neither one nor the other. And here he adds very important words, 4 important words. Kiron, ata, bazman hazeh, such as the present time, today. Rabbeinu Hananel is referring to his own time 1,000 years ago. Let me remind you, 1,000 years ago, there was no Mikdash. 1,000 years ago, the Jewish people had no state, no country, no sovereignty. There were very few Jews living in Eretz Yisrael at that time, very few. There were some, not many. The vast majority of the Jewish people lived elsewhere, as opposed to today, for example, where approximately 50% of the Jewish people lives in Eretz Yisrael. The Jewish people were not an economic and military superpower, which, whether some people like it or not, we are.
According to the Goyim, anyway.
I'm not going to say according to whom. There are objective facts which speak for themselves. And the reality, therefore, today certainly cannot be claimed to be worse than the time of Rabbeinu Hananel 1,000 years ago. If he says about his day that at the present time, in my time, Rabbeinu Hananel is saying, today it is a situation of en shalom, or en shemad, it's an intermediate situation, and therefore the 3 fast days are optional and not obligatory. Kal v'chomer, how much more so is that correct and true with regards to our present situation? Now, I'm sure you've never heard this before.
Yeah.
I'm probably the first rabbi who's ever said to you that in actual fact, if you fasted 2 weeks ago on the Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, you weren't actually obligated to do so. I'm sure no one's actually ever said this to you. But
did a long time ago.
maybe I did. I don't recall. But the point is, I'm telling you now, and that's the truth. That's the truth of the matter. It's a big shock to the system for a lot of people to hear this, but it happens to be true. It happens to be true.
Haredi won't believe you.
Not only is it true, we find this idea and this psak halacha repeated time and again in the generations before the time of Rabbeinu Hananel. That is to say, before 1,000 years ago, 1,100, 1,200, 1,300 years ago, we see exactly the same thing. Look in source number 5. It says there, quoting one of the Geonim, before Rabbeinu Hananel, this is where Rabbeinu Hananel got these ideas from. It says here, Bezman Hazeh, at the present time, this is being written probably about 1,200 years ago, Badorot halalu, in these generations, she'en shemad wa en shalom, rasu mithanim, lo rasu en mithanim. That's the halacha. Hilachach. Therefore, shalosha somoth, with regards to the 3 fast days, mi she'eno roseh lasum, he who does not wish to fast, en bechach klum. That's okay, it's fine, he doesn't have to. We're not mechuyav bahem. That's what it says. And this statement is repeated again in a second source, which I'm not going to quote to you again, but it says exactly the same thing, which I quote here on the page from Sharei Teshuvah Siman Ayin Zayin, which is a Teshuvah from another Gaon, and there's a third quote from another Gaon in Shibulei Aleket, which appears here on the page before you below, exactly the same psak halacha. And I will tell you here something else that's not on the page before you, which I only took note of very recently. For some reason, I did not look up the halachot gedolot on this sugya. The halachot gedolot is a sefer of halacha, a very important halachic work that was written 1,200 plus years ago by Rabbi Shimon Kaira, who was from the time of the Geonim in Bavel. It is one of the most authoritative and highly thought of works of halacha ever written after the time of the Talmud. And there it says very simply, it says a Jew is required, I haven't quoted it here, but I'll give over to you in English in simple words what it says. It says a Jew is required to fast and mourn on Tisha B'Av. That's what it says. And then it goes on to quote the pasuk from Zechariah, where it mentions 4 fast days, not 1. But it says a Jew is required to fast on 4 days, on 1 day, Tisha B'Av. And then later on he goes on to say, and in a period which is neither shalom nor shemad, an intermediate period, then the other 3 fast days are optional. That's what the halachot gedolot says. So that's a further source, a very authoritative source from the time of the Geonim, with exactly the same information that we just saw here. And I saw even more recently that there is a second, even more accurate version of halachot gedolot according to a manuscript that was published many years ago already, which I have. And I looked it up in that version, called the Mekitzeni Damim or Hildesheimer edition. And there, the opinion of the halachot gedolot is even more straightforward and more unequivocal. He says, at the present time, when which is neither shemad nor shalom, in his own day, he says, these days are optional. In other words, there's no question that amongst all of the Geonim without exception, and Rabbeinu Hananel, who came immediately after the Geonim and who always follows their views, he was a Talmid of Rav Hai Gaon, who was the last of the Geonim. There is no question that in their view, their period of history was one of en shalom or en shema. There was neither one nor the other. It was relatively calm. Why do we say so? And why did they think so? Because that was their historical reality. The Jews in most parts of the world, many people don't know this again, by and large, both in the Christian world and in the Muslim world, the Jews they weren't necessarily given special treatment for the better than anybody else, but they were not necessarily persecuted very severely, or even often not at all, by the governments and the kingdoms and empires of the time. In fact, in some countries, the Jews lived under the protection of the king. They had special rights, even sometimes more than some of the regular non-Jewish citizens, because the kings were interested in Jews living in their countries, because they knew that if Jews lived in their countries, then commerce and business would improve and increase. And this was the case, for example, in Germany. Charlemagne, who founded what was called euphemistically the Holy Roman Empire, which one historian pointed out once was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but he literally imported Jews. He encouraged Jews to come from northern Italy to Germany, and he wrote out special laws to define their status as protected subjects of the king, and they were almost untouchable. That situation historically changed from approximately the time of the First Crusade onwards, both not only in the Christian world, which is an obvious result of the First Crusade, but also, interestingly, in the Muslim world, for different historical reasons, developments that occurred. In all the Jewish world, basically, it became the reality at the end of the 11th century. The First Crusade began in the year 1095. At the end of the 11th century, and from that time onwards, the persecution of Jews almost all over the world began to increase severely.
Wait, during the Crusades?
During and after. And there was not just one crusade, there was a second and a third and a fourth. But starting from that time, the situation of the Jews deteriorated severely, both in the Christian world, and shortly afterwards it began also in the Muslim world for other reasons. There's a reason, for example, why the Rambam in the 12th century, he was born in Spain, as we know, he had to flee Spain. Why did he flee Spain? Because the Jews were being persecuted. Not just persecuted, they didn't have to pay an extra poll tax or something, which they always had to do. They were persecuted to the extent that many were murdered because they refused to convert to Islam, and many converted outwardly, for outward appearances, to Islam in order to prevent being killed or having their property confiscated, etc. This was going on in the Muslim world. That's why the Rambam and his family fled Spain, and eventually first they came to Eretz Israel. They couldn't stay here. The situation was very difficult. As we said, the situation had changed for the worse, and they ended up settling in Egypt, as we know. This is why, from that time onwards, amongst all the Rishonim who came after that time, they all say, nowadays we all have to fast. And that's entirely true. There's no question that's true. So when the Ramban, who lived in the 13th century, writes that nowadays all the four fast days are absolutely obligatory and compulsory, he's absolutely correct. There's no question, because the situation has changed radically. Now the situation is one of shemad. It's not en shemad or en shalom. It's definite shemad, because in Christian Spain, in Muslim Spain, in Germany, in France, in North Africa, in all parts of the Jewish world, in Taiman, the Jews are being persecuted severely. There's a reason again why the Rambam wrote Igeret Taiman, the letter to the Jews in Taiman. Why did he have to write this letter? To encourage them and to give them certain instruction. Because they were being forcibly converted to Islam. And the situation, this is something that had not occurred before. So when we see the attitude of the great Chachamim towards these fast days change and alter, there is a reason. Because the objective historical facts also changed and altered. And this brings us to the present day. Today, people are used to reading the halachic sources that were written 700 years ago, 600 years ago, 500 years ago. When I say 700 years ago, I mean, shall we say, the Ramban or the Tur. And if I say 500 years ago, I'm referring to the Shulchan Aruch. And if I say 300 years ago or 200 years ago, then I'm referring to latter-day Posukim, anyone you wish to name, the Magen Avraham, or the Taz, or more closer to our time, nearly 100 years ago, the Mishnah Berurah. They're all talking as if these fast days are obligatory. Why? Because the situation had changed and was continued to be very dire for many centuries. Even in the time of the Chafetz Chaim, who wrote the Mishnah Berurah, shall we say, there was definite shemad. In Russia, 12-year-old boys, 10-year-old boys were being taken away for 25 years to the Russian army as part of a deliberate policy of shemad.
Sure.
And similar things were happening in other parts of the world. The situation only changed in a very meaningful, significant way closer to our own time. But if you look around the world today, where do you see today any open and clear policy, government policy of Shemad directed against Jews? In which country today can a Jew not keep Shabbat and not study Torah if he wishes to?
You won't.
I don't think there is such a country. And if there is such a country, it's one out of 100 countries.
Maybe Saudi Arabia. If the real
Well, according to the law in Saudi Arabia, a Jew is not allowed to reside in Saudi Arabia. So that, as I say, there are a couple of countries, or more even, that are not friendly, but there's no Jews there. And the Jews are able to live elsewhere. And in fact, they can't live there even if they wish to. And any country you choose to name, even countries which we tend to associate with anti-Semitism very correctly, with justification. Countries like Germany, countries like Russia, etc. Today, there are many Jews in these countries, and they're able to act, religiously speaking, as they wish. I'm not claiming that all the non-Jews in the world have become Philo-Semites, that everybody loves us. I'm not saying that. There are plenty of Gentiles who do support us and do love us, and there are plenty, probably a lot more, who do not. And that is not what we're referring to. We're referring to the historical, political, social reality on the ground. That reality today is such that the Jewish people are not suffering from shmad in any part of the known world, as far as I know. And if there is such a place somewhere on the planet, perhaps in Teiman you could claim there are maybe 30 Jews left in Teiman today, literally, and they are suffering to some extent, so I understand. You can't decide that the national condition and circumstance of the Jewish people should be based on the reality of 30 Jews in Teiman today, when you have millions of Jews all over the world and a totally diametrically opposite type of reality. So this, of course, raises the question, how should we relate to these 3 fast days today? I think you could begin to get a sense of where I'm going with this, what the halakha should be. But before we even discuss further today, we should think about the time of Beit Sheni. The time of Beit Sheni, 2,000 years ago, when we had a mikdash, true, but we did not have Jewish sovereignty. There was no Jewish army. There were periods under Roman occupation where the Jews were being severely persecuted, etc. What were the Jewish people doing at that time? Here we turn to the Rambam. If you look in the Rambam, source number 6 on your source sheet. Does someone have the time? Okay. Rambam says in source number 6 on the Mishnah that we studied in Rosh Hashanah, he says, "V'vayit sheni lo hayu mit'anim lo 10 b'tevet v'lo 17 b'tamuz, ela haroseh yit'aneh or shelo yit'aneh." The other fast days during the time of Beit Sheni were optional, says Rambam, as we just saw before in the Geonim. At the end he says, "V'hayu mit'anim tisha b'av af al pi shehu masur lirasonam mipnei shehu chpelu b'osarot." However, they did fast on Tisha B'Av. Without going into a long discourse about the sugya in Rosh Hashanah, which we haven't gone to in great depth, the Rambam here is telling us that he understands the sugya very differently from most of the Rishonim. It's very, very interesting. Most of the Rishonim are convinced, without any clear proof either way, that during Beit Sheni, the Jewish people did not fast on any of the 4 fast days, including not Tisha B'Av. And their reasoning is very simple. There's a mikdash standing, so why fast? Why should you fast? There is a mikdash. In other words, they saw the equation in very simple black and white terms, simple terms. If there's a mikdash, no fast. If there's no mikdash, you do fast. You have to fast. Rambam clearly does not look at it that way. Rambam says that according to the din, according to halakha, they did not have to fast on any of the fast days, including Tisha B'Av, but they chose to fast on Tisha B'Av because it's considered a more serious day of mourning than the others. Now we have to begin to think how the Rambam understood this idea, this concept. Why would they choose to fast when the mikdash stood? And the answer is because, I think it's obvious, because the situation was not perfect. It was far from perfect. You have Roman occupation, you have no Jewish sovereignty, you haven't got a Jewish monarchy, a Jewish government. The Jewish people are suffering at the hands of the Romans. Yes, there is a mikdash, true, and up to a certain point before the Khurban there was also a Sanhedrin, etc. But the situation is far from perfect. So therefore, the Rambam says the Jewish people saw that reality as being en shalom or en shamad, something intermediate, something not terrible, not a disaster, but also not as things should be, far from what things should be. And therefore they chose to fast on that day. All the Rishonim, it should be noted, understand it differently. But I think, to me, it seems the Rambam's position is very, very correct. Very correct. He understands it from the way he reads the Mishnah and the way he reads the Sugya, which we can't go into right now. But he understands from that Sugya that in Beit Sheni the Jews fasted on one of the 4 fast days, on Tisha B'Av, and the other 3 were optional. And to me, it seems clear that the same is true today. Today, as we saw in the Sugya, as all the Geonim write, without exception, as Rambam himself also explains regarding the time of Beit Sheni, when the situation is as it is today, and our situation today in many ways is comparable to Beit Sheni. It's not the same, but it's comparable. It's not the same because they had a mikdash, and we don't have yet, not yet, we don't have a mikdash. But we have a powerful state. They did not. They were living under foreign rule. We're a military power, we're economically, we're strong. That was not the case necessarily at that time. It was difficult to see also how the Jews would any time in the foreseeable future be able to free themselves of the yoke of the Roman Empire, whereas today we're living under nobody's yoke. Therefore, the reality today, you're going like this, and I saw that. You thought I didn't see that, but I did, and that's okay, because you're saying to yourself, well, the Americans still boss us about, etc. But that's entirely true. But it's equally true that the Americans boss the UK about, and the Americans boss Germany about, and the Europeans snub their noses at the Americans every second day, because that's how the world works. Because there is no one universal empire there that rules everything and can tell everybody what to do. Everybody's trying to tell everybody what to do. The Russians do what they can do to throw a spanner into the works of the Americans, and the Americans do exactly the same thing back as the Russians. If you don't believe me, read the news from today, from yesterday, from last week, from a year ago regarding Syria, for example. All countries today in the world as we know it live in a reality where they are not free to do as they wish to do all the time. They always have to take into account certain contingencies, certain influences, certain interests and pressures from other peoples, other nations, other organizations. If Italy wants to do something which angers the Iranians, they have to think about it 10 times, because they have commerce with the Iranians to the tune of billions of dollars a year. And if the Iranians are upset, and we know they're easily upset, unfortunately, they're sensitive people, what can you do? So they get upset easily.
Just give them $400
No, but the Italians are worried about billions of dollars worth of trade. So before they can do something against the Iranians for organizing a terror attack in Italy, they have to think about what the result will be regarding their billions of dollars of trade. That is how the world works. So to tell me that the Americans like to boss us around sometimes, and sometimes we have leaders like Netanyahu who buckles under pressure, that's true. But the same is true for the French president, the same is true for the Russian president. So what? That doesn't prove that we are not living in a situation which is in every way different from the time of Beit Sheni, with one exception, one major exception, and that is the spiritual state of the Jewish people and the Mikdash.
Right, and the korbanot, and
It's all related.
Why?
There was no Shekhinah in Beit Sheni.
Okay. But it was in the first one, and we're mourning.
But I'm comparing now the second Mikdash to the time of the second Mikdash to the present day.
Yes,
Rambam says at that time they fasted only one of 4 fast days.
Okay, but they had korbanot. Right?
Yes, but they didn't have all the other things we discussed. If that was sufficient to say, well, we have korbanot, so everything's in order, then they shouldn't have fasted on Tisha B'Av either, according to the Rambam, but they did. In other words, the Rambam looks at the bigger picture. He looks at the entire picture and not just one part, one element of the jigsaw puzzle. There are many pieces in this jigsaw puzzle called the state of the nation, like the Americans have a State of the Nation address. Well, the Jewish people, we don't have one of those yet, a State of the Nation address. Maybe we will one day. But when we do, we will have to have a leadership that will know how to analyze our national reality. Our national reality is such that it is made up of many different parts, and they form a larger picture, a larger whole. The Rambam sees the overall picture of Beit Sheni. He says that is a situation which is neither perfect, far from it, and also neither catastrophic in every way. However, when the Churban came along, and when the Bar Kochva revolt was crushed by the Romans, etc., that was a situation of Shema. Then all the fast days kicked in once again. And then again that situation changed. We see that Rabbi Yudah Nasi, only a generation after Bar Kochva, he already was in favor of nullifying Tisha B'Av and the other fast days. So we read in the Talmud. So we see the reality of these fast days is always something to be examined and reassessed by the Chachamim of that time, whether it is at this point a day which, as we said at the beginning, these days are days where we must fast, days when we are not allowed to fast, but in fact must rejoice and thank Hashem, or somewhere in the middle, in which case those days are optional. Before I end, I want to mention the following. Yes?
Because Tisha B'Av really comes out on Shabbat, we can fast. So it's on Sunday,
Yes.
which is, I think, less stringent.
That's true also, but other days, other years it falls during the week when we fast on the day. But that's not the issue right now. If it wasn't necessary to fast, if it wasn't an obligation to fast, then we wouldn't fast on the Sunday either. So I'm not suggesting we shouldn't fast on the Sunday. I'm saying we have to fast on the Sunday. I am saying that this year and last year, and we'll see what happens next year. I don't know yet what will happen next year. To fast on Shiva Sabat Tammuz was not a chovah, but it was a reshut. It was optional. Now a person may ask me and say, well, if it's not a sin to fast, why are you busy telling us that we don't have to fast? Isn't it better that Jews fast than not fast? Isn't that a better thing for Jews to do, to show that they care about the Mikdash and to mourn and not to forget about these things, not to let it out of their minds and their awareness? My answer to that question is no, it's not really a better response. The reason it's not a better response is because to me it seems that the vast majority of frum Jews today in the world, and it doesn't matter now whether they're Haredi or Dati Leumi or any stripe or any persuasion of religious, to them, fasting on these different fast days, whether it's Shiva Sabat Tammuz or Tzom Gedalia or Tisha B'Av, fasting on these fast days is just one more religious obligation. It's something that you have to do. Just like when you get up in the morning, you have to say, the bracha Shelo Asani Nuchri, or when you eat a piece of bread, you have to say Mosi Lechem Min Haaretz, and when when Shabbat rolls along, you have to keep Shabbat because you're a Jew. In the same way, a Jew has to fast on day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. That's just how it is. They don't think about why they're fasting. It doesn't motivate them to begin to wonder, why is it that we haven't got a mikdash? Why is nothing moving on that score, on that front? It's just something that you do. And as soon as they do it, they feel that they've performed their obligation. I fasted, what do you want from me? I did my bit. Right, I was hungry today. I didn't eat. I waited the whole day now till the evening to eat. I did my share. That's what I have to do. That's what good Jews do. And the truth of the matter is that that's not the truth. That's not true. It's not real. Because what's important is that we think and analyze and ask ourselves the question, why are we in the situation we are today, which, as we said, is en shemad wa en shalom, neither a total catastrophe nor shalom, neither a perfect situation. Why are we in that reality? Why are things not better? How are we going to move from where we are today, here, to this point over here? What's going to move us in that direction? What do we need to do to change and to affect that change? If we continue doing exactly as our forefathers did 500 years ago, when it was necessary to fast on all 4 fast days, min hadin, according to halakha, because the situation was much, much more dire and severe, if that's what we continue to do, as if nothing has changed, then we're just moving along in a kind of a stupor. We're just walking along, as it were, like a sleepwalker. We're not thinking, we're not analyzing, we're not even aware that these fast days are not fixed in as people imagine, but rather their status has to be examined from time to time, and therefore the whole message of those fast days is lost. So really, I question the value of fasting in such a fashion. Much more valuable, it seems to me, would be to take those days of Shiva Asar B'Tammuz and Tzom Gedalia and Asara B'Tevet, and of course also Tisha B'Av, and to organize conferences and workshops and all kinds of activities for people to come and hear a real discussion about what is incumbent upon the Jewish people. Are we supposed to worry about the Mikdash, or does it fall from heaven, for example? And if it doesn't fall from heaven, how's it going to happen? Well, what are we waiting for? Or is it the government's job? Well, how do we move things in that direction? That's a much more meaningful, much more constructive, and when it comes down to it, a much more correct and Torah approach to how to commemorate those days, rather than simply muddling along in the galut mode of Judaism, which without thinking and just assuming that whatever was in the past has to be today, ma she'aya hu she'yeh, because that's how some people understand Judaism, but that's not true. Judaism is always alive, is always relative to and relevant to the times, to the realities on the ground, and this halakha is the best proof and the best example of that very fact. Shalom, shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.